Yeah, the claim is Christian salvation enables sinful behavior. I've had this debate so many times with the Arminian Calvinism
Yeah.
debate and cheap grace and things like that. But it is something that Muslims raise. So why would Muslims ask this question according to Islam and their views of God's mercy? I don't know. I'm not familiar with Islamic teaching about God's grace, but I do know that they claim that God is merciful, and if God's merciful, it's a different thing. But when Christians talk about grace, for some reason, God's just sort of saying, "Oh, well, you can do whatever you want, and then God will just forgive you." That's the caricature, or I should say, the false stereotype that's being sort of. It's a straw man, obviously, because
Yeah.
Christianity does not teach that. But
And we'll
how
show
would
where and
you
when.
how would you respond to that?
Well, the best way to take the approach is, again, just like the previous issue, make them play by their own rules. And like you mentioned, you're not too familiar with the Quranic view of Allah, and Muslims are counting on that. And unfortunately, Muslim teachers are hoping their Muslim students also aren't aware of that. So when they're regurgitating this information, you might have to first convert them to Islam before actually showing them what Christianity teaches, because they're not aware of what either are putting forward. We talked about on Monday how there is an example, a Sahih narration from Sahih Bukhari 6664 through 6668. Don't read too much into that numbering system. There's over 7,000, so inevitably you're going to run into that number. Allah is basically going to lay out three types of people on Judgment Day as far as Muslims are concerned: those who will be given an easy account, a moderate account, and those who will be carrying sins as heavy as mountains. And then Allah will ask the angels, who are these? And He knows what's best about them. The angels will say, they are humble servants of yours. They were Muslims. Then He will say, take the sins off of the Muslims and put them on the backs of Christians and Jews, and they will be pointed to and said, this is your ransom from hellfire. Now, a Muslim with that foreknowledge, and note, this isn't in the Quranic text to be taken advantage of, isn't in the Hadith either, but when you put that accusation forward and say, well, with that knowledge in advance, doesn't that mean that you could just load up your sins as heavy as a mountain, and as long as you're a Muslim, Allah will let you into paradise? Doesn't that enable sinful behavior? And you could say, well, no Muslim has ever taken it that way. Well, let's note something that hopefully is as abhorrent to you as it is to me: the 9/11 hijackers. Why is it that the popular media sources were claiming and denying that they were ever Muslims to begin with? Because these paragons of Muslim virtue that were willing to lay down their lives in slaughtering infidels when they hijacked the three airliners, they were going to strip clubs and engaging in all sorts of debauchery and alcohol and the sort of things that Islam forbids or declares as haram. What's interesting about that is that if you were to ask them, were they, of course, not sincere Muslims when they were giving their lives for Islam the next day? They tried to make a dichotomy and say that these are two different things. What those jihadists were doing and what Muslims actually believe aren't in alignment. But here's the problem. Where did they get that idea?
Yeah.
And it wasn't from Sahih Bukhari per se, but it was a historical promise that has motivated terrorist attacks from the foundation of Islam itself, and that is at the Battle of Badr. Muhammad had, of course, not been very gentle with the Meccan pagans up until this point. They kicked him out of the city because he kept abusing and mocking their forefathers and traditions. But what's interesting about the Battle of Badr is it was the seventh in a long series of harassment and terrorist campaigns against their caravans, which they depended on for their livelihood. And as they were traveling from Mecca to wherever else they could gather resources, it ultimately stemmed from them not wanting anything to do with Muhammad. 6 times Muslims attacked, and 6 times they just went without food. At the 7th, they sent an armed detachment to protect the caravan, and Muslims were outnumbered in the battle. There's other implications of this. Allah deceived Muhammad into thinking there were fewer in order to give them morale, and this was an example of Allah being the greatest of deceivers. But another interesting thing was stated, and this is again what motivates terrorists to this day. If you die in your struggle, jihad, against the infidel, you are guaranteed paradise. Now, this is something that every Muslim sorely needs, because assurance of salvation is as absent from Islam as the most radical neo-Calvinist would consider the unelect. You do not have any idea about whether or not you are saved, according to Muhammad himself. At the funeral of one of the most righteous Muslims that they had ever known, he said, I do not know what Allah is going to do with him. I don't know what Allah is going to do with me. And that was the Prophet speaking, the most perfect man according to Muslim culture. So if that's then the case, and you even note and take into consideration Allah's deception, that if he preordained you for wrath, it doesn't matter what you do or why. If you commit jihad, that is the only and the greatest assurance of paradise, because even the rightly guided caliphs, Muhammad's immediate successors, what would be comparable to the 12 apostles in Christianity, said, if I had one foot in paradise, I would still fear Allah's deception. He would be casting me into the hellfire. So the point is this. When we look at enablement of sinful behavior, because I can take this concept and passage and run with it in the wrong direction, if it's a problem for you, it's a problem for me. And if it's a problem for me, it's a problem for you. If this is an accusation, and this is what you need to be prepared for, know a little bit of history, know a little bit of the passages, but you don't even have to know a word of Islamic tradition in order to be able to say, that's not what we believe at all. And you say, oh yes it is, and then they'll give some, as you said, caricature of what salvation and Christianity is all about. But if there's a word-for-word verse I could quote you that says, full stipulation, don't do that, and there are multiple, but the most direct that you could commit to memory is Romans chapter 6 and verse 1. Shall I say, and let me read it, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Verse 2,
May it
certainly
never be.
not. Yeah, don't let it even be a thought. How can we who died to sin live any longer in it? 2 verses, start of the chapter. Freely available. If the Bible itself condemns that mindset, then you can't say our religion teaches it. But if on the other hand you'd say, well, of course Christians are going to take this and run with it, so why wasn't your God competent enough to have the foresight to prevent that? You can then put it on them and say, why did Muhammad lay down a standard and rule for paradise being motivated by mass murder and cause terrorism?
Well, we do have things in place. It's called church discipline.
Yeah. So the point being made is just that. Make them play by their own rules. That'll require a little bit of homework, but the easiest way to respond to it is to say, my book says that you're doing that wrong. And that would be as much a note of condemnation against Christians as it would Muslims who think that's what it teaches.